Hello, and welcome to a conversation with documentary filmmaker Bernardo Ruiz with special guest Alex Bernal. My name is Sarah Zenaida Gould, and I'm the interim executive director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. We're glad you could join us tonight. I'd like to start by introducing our guests. First up is Bernardo Ruiz, who is a two-time Emmy-nominated documentary filmmaker and member of the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences. He was born in Guanajuato and grew up in Brooklyn. His directorial feature debut, Reportero, which aired on PBS's POV in 2013, about a group of reporters at a Tijuana weekly who cover organized crime and political corruption, was described by New York Magazine as a powerful reminder of how journalism often requires immense amounts of physical and psychological bravery. His second feature documentary, Kingdom of Shadows, which aired on PBS's POV in 2016 and premiered at South by Southwest, has been described by Slacker Wood. Many documentaries have chronicled the drug war in the US and Mexico, but few have humanized it as poignantly as Kingdom of Shadows. It is more observant than crusading, rooted in first-rate journalism. The New York Times called it unforgettable. 2 years ago, in 2018, he released his documentary Harvest Season, which moved into an entirely different terrain, probing the lives of the temporary laborers, permanent residents, and multi-generational Latinos intimately connected to the production of premium wines in Napa and Sonoma in Northern California. In the midst of one of the most dramatic grape harvests in recent memory, the film was nominated for a James Beard Broadcast Media Award. Earlier this week, his film Latino Vote, Dispatches from the Battleground, aired on PBS's Voces, and it's available for streaming on pbs.org through November the 3rd. Also with us is Alex Bernal, the advocacy manager at Move Texas. In his role with Move Texas, he leads issue-based campaigns affecting the lives of young people, building power across the state of Texas. Alex helped found Move San Antonio during his time studying anthropology and political science at the University of Texas at San Antonio, and is also an experienced community advocate and organizer. Recently, Alex has helped in the fight for paid sick time to pass cite and release policies in San Antonio and San Marcos, and helps lead in passing voting rights reforms in Bexar, Dallas, Hayes, Webb, and Harris counties. He also served a year term on the National Political Committee of the Democratic Socialists of America, a 16-member body and the highest political arm of that organization. So I want to welcome our guests and say that I'm going to begin the conversation with a number of questions, but I want to invite the audience to share their own questions in the Facebook Live. So send those questions our way, and we'll try to answer those. I'm going to start with Alex. Alex, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, your work, and how you got involved in the film project?
Sure. So first of all, thank you so much, Sarah, for the invitation to be here. Really glad to be with you all tonight. My name is Alex Bernal, as you mentioned. I'm the advocacy manager at Move Texas, and I helped start the organization Move as a student group in 2013 at the University of Texas at San Antonio, way back in the salad days, much scrappier DIY. And if you would have told me that, 6 years on, it'd be a statewide organization, 7 years on rather, it'd be a statewide organization, I would have told you that you're dreaming. But here we are, having built power all across the state of Texas, registering voters at over 60 college campuses across the state, helping young people pass progressive policy at city council and state levels every day. And so I'm really humbled to do that work. For me personally, this work starts a lot earlier in my life. Politics has always been at my dinner table. My dad was a Spanish linguist in the US military, and was really a case of the economic draft in a small town in Michigan. Tested very high on his military exams and was offered the opportunity to sort of do whatever it is that he desired. And so he trained as a Spanish linguist in a unique convergence of personal and political history just around the time that the US invaded the country of Panama in the ouster of Noriega. And so him and my mom actually met during that event. And so politics has always been present at my dinner table based on that life history. And so, they've always encouraged me to think about world affairs, to think about politics, to think about building power. And so for me, political conversations really started since I was a kid, having, a mom from another country in Latin America and a dad, who definitely had humble beginnings here in the United States, and all of the complexities that come about from that. In addition to that, I grew up with cerebral palsy, so I've always been familiar with inequity as it presents itself in schooling, as it presents itself in body normativity. Always contemplated these kinds of questions. Even as a little kid. And so I've always been familiar with, needing to speak up for yourself. And so for me, all of these things converged and have just sort of made me by nature a political person. And so, going to high school, I got into things like high school debate, where I became really familiar with a lot of political literature, books about history, met company that was my own and birds of a feather. And a lot of those friends that I made during that competitive activity, I actually ended up going to school with at the University of Texas at San Antonio. And we wanted to, start a political organization that was a little less armchair. We were always used to talking with one another about politics, but we wanted to see if we actually knew what it is that we thought we knew. So we started to organize. We started to register folks to vote there on campus. We did it eccentric in the early days. We would wear things like robot costumes and banana suits. It was the beginning of social media, Instagram, Twitter. So folks would come up to us and they'd want to know why we were wearing costumes, and we'd use it as a hook to register folks to vote. And we had a whole theory of change behind why, registering folks to vote, young person to young person, is more effective than checking a box at the DPS. That, if that's your first step into political activity, that to have it be a disengaging kind of rote activity, checking a box, it's a really missed opportunity to have a deeper political conversation with people of our age. And so, that work really blossomed. It expanded across campuses there in San Antonio. And, as I said before, now 7 years on, we're a statewide organization that's building young people's power all across the state of Texas. And just by virtue of where we are, just by virtue of the changing demographics of the state, by and large, that means a lot of Latinx youth as well.
Yep. So there was a little delay there. So, but Bernardo's with us now. Thank you for racing through the traffic to make it, Bernardo. I already introduced you and Alex, and Alex was just telling us a little bit about himself. So maybe we can do the same for you, Bernardo. If you could just talk a little bit about your career, how you became a documentary filmmaker, and more specifically, how you became a documentary filmmaker that focuses on Latino voices and experiences.
Sure. I mean, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for the invitation. I love San Antonio, so anything San Antonio related is always, I'm always happy to do, and a good excuse. And also just an incredible pleasure to be on a panel with Alex, whose work we profiled in Dispatches from the Battleground. I just want to quickly say, when we were researching organizations that are looking to mobilize and empower Latinx youth, I mean youth in general, youth political power, but Latinx voters, we were extremely intrigued by what Move Texas was doing, and talking to Alex and team was kind of a revelation for us, and it's a big part of why Alex and team feature prominently in the documentary, because obviously, youth power is the future, and it's very exciting to see efforts to really, to mobilize youth voters in very concrete and specific ways and kind of meaningful ways. So shout out to Move Texas for all of the good work that they do. You know, as far as I'm concerned as a filmmaker, I was someone who's always interested in journalism, investigative journalism, pretty early on, and movies, fictional movies. And it wasn't until I got into my early 20s that I realized those two things could come together in one, and that by making documentaries, I could do a little bit of both. And that is use the tools of good journalism, of investigation, of research, of shining a light on critical issues, but doing it with playing with the tools of cinema. So still caring about, you know, composition and storytelling and all of those things that I love. So for me, that's why I make documentaries. It's that marriage of journalism and investigation and hearing directly from voices, coupled with visual storytelling. And I think that's what a lot of documentarians are drawn to, is the ability to do both of those things at once.
Yeah, that was one of the reasons why I was so excited to have you here tonight, was that MACRI, the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute, is focused on bringing Mexican American civil rights history to the general public. So we're doing public history work, and documentarians are doing public history work too. And actually, one of my favorite documentaries is your film Harvest Season, which is, for those of you who haven't seen it, it's about grape vineyards in Northern California, Napa, Sonoma, and some Latinos who own vineyards, as well as particularly Mexican migrants who work in that industry and basically keep that industry going. And even though I'm not from California, my family does have a history of farm working. And so it really resonated with me in terms of how fragile farm working is and how fragile farms are. And just beautifully shot. That's one of the things I have noticed about your films, is they're really beautifully shot, and they tell these complicated stories. And so I was hoping maybe you could comment a little bit about your approach to storytelling.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate the kind words about the filmmaking. You know, I think a lot about, I mean, all of us here, I think about the public commons a lot, right? And about memory and intellectual history and activism. And, you know, often I rely on colleagues and friends who are scholars or activists to be able to kind of probe more deeply about an issue. And often I find that, you know, there's really exciting work being done at that intersection of, you know, activism and scholarship. But those stories don't always get outside of a small circle. I think the challenge is that in academia, it's a kind of small circle of people who are talking about, you know, histories or an issue, doesn't get out to the broader public. And so I think one thing I am interested in is how to get at the nuance of some of the stories that maybe some of us are aware of and get them out into a broader context. And I feel like doing that through, the best way to do that is through experiential filmmaking. That is, as much as possible, try to put viewers in the shoes and in the experiences of the participants in the film, the people that we're documenting. And so I love verite filmmaking. I love being able to spend a lot of time with participants. For Harvest Season, I love doing it because I also got to drink wine almost every shoot day. So that was also very important for me. But you know, to try to put people in the viewers in the shoes of the folks who are following. I think the other thing is I like for there to be a conversation so that the participants are talking back and helping shape the story, and you know, that it be a dialogue and a collaboration. But in terms of influences, you know, I like, not to get too highfalutin, but I like, you know, Robert Altman's films that are about lots of competing perspectives, because I don't believe that anyone has a kind of hold on, you know, kind of pure truth. And so I like the idea of lots of voices shaping something. So I find that very interesting. I like those kind of complex, nuanced stories. So in Harvest Season, as you point out, it's a layered story. So there are stories of folks who are recent arrivals, who H-2A, who came in on visas, H-2A visas, to work in the fields. So a recent immigrant from Michoacan. Then you have second generation folks more like me and probably like you, second or third generation, we've been here, and have, who are trying to be artists or trying to be entrepreneurs. And so I like looking at those layers and seeing what the kind of points of tension are and where there's kind of stories that I'm not seeing in other places.
Okay, so in harvest season, and we are going to move on to the new film, I promise, but in harvest season, there's a scene where one of the people who, he's like a manager of a farm worker housing center, he's watching TV and Donald Trump is giving a speech. And then a couple of scenes later, there's a horrible fire and it's sweeping across the valley, and farm workers' lives are put at risk with the smoke and the insulation. And also one of the featured farms, he loses a bunch of his vineyard. Just recently, we've had these horrible fires in California, coupled with the pandemic, coupled with, of course, a new election. And so Donald Trump is in the news every day. And so, in a way, even though that film is a few years old, it still feels so relevant. And I do wonder, did that feed into what led you to this project, the Latino Vote, or how did the Latino Vote film project come together?
Sure. Well, I appreciate you referencing that sequence in harvest season, and it's available to stream for free on Amazon and often on pbs.org. But I think that's the thing about documentary is that, unlike fiction, films and fiction, we're not controlling what's happening. In fact, we're documenting and reacting to events as they're unfolding. But to your point, I think what we're seeing is, some of these perennial structural issues, they're not going away. So obviously climate change, there's an urgency to that issue. So we were filming in 2017 and we were following the participants in that film, this Mexican diaspora in California that, is really the backbone of the premium wine industry in California. Without immigrant labor and second and third generation folks who have roots in Mexico, there would, and Latinx in general, there wouldn't be a wine industry as we know it. And yet that story has really been neglected. But as I was trying to tell that story, the wildfires hit in large part because of climate change, in large part because of what we're continuing to face and encounter. And so at that point, I felt like my job is to follow the river, follow the story, and hold on as much as possible. And similarly with Latino Vote, we started off with a plan. I have a great group of collaborators, Andrea Cordova, who's a wonderful filmmaker and my producer on this project, and Daniela Quiros, who's a terrific editor based here in New York. We were thinking about following the election cycle, which is enough of a ride in and of itself, looking at different aspects of the Latinx vote, with Move Texas and the youth vote being this prominent piece of it. But of course, the pandemic hit. And in one way, that was kind of a curveball. But in another way, all it really did is reinforce and kind of highlight the issues that we cared about, which are, inequality, healthcare, who counts and who doesn't in this country. And so I think while there are these twists and turns, ultimately, I think it ends up highlighting these events, these big events end up highlighting the issues that we're talking about. Same thing with the mobilizations around, the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. So these moments might feel like outside moments, but in fact, they're kind of central to the story we're trying to tell. And it's our job to document and follow as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you have good timing or bad timing, but okay, so you were making harvest season and wildfires broke out. You were making Latino Vote and pandemic broke out. But how did the pandemic impact the process of making the film? And also, I think you were kind of on a timeline because you wanted to get this out before the election, right? So just talk about filmmaking in a pandemic.
Well, our first concern, well, like everyone else, we had no idea what was going to happen. And so we dutifully shut down our little office and thought this might be, a few weeks. But as we saw that this is, going to become a much bigger and more difficult situation, and I think all of us in our team were impacted in different ways. I live in a neighborhood. It's an immigrant neighborhood in Queens, in Jackson Heights, Queens, New York. And I live very close to Elmhurst Hospital, which is one of the hospitals that had the highest incidences of COVID illnesses and deaths in New York in April and the kind of early stages of the pandemic. So it meant that here we were hearing ambulances all the time, helicopters overhead, and what are typically very busy, crowded streets, completely emptied out. And it was a very disturbing feeling. The only feeling I can kind of, that kind of was comparable to me was what New York looked and felt like after September 11th. Businesses were shuttered, streets were empty. And then we began hearing about friends and neighbors who were out of work or people who were getting sick. And all of these mom and pop businesses, the street vendors, the little restaurants in this neighborhood, we could see them putting, up for lease signs and shutting down, people selling equipment. So the devastation just became quickly apparent, I think, as it did to anybody who was kind of paying attention in their communities. And at that, while I had some hesitancy about documenting what was going to happen, it then felt like, wait a second, this is a historic moment. This is what, other documentarians and other moments cover these events. And I felt that responsibility to cover as much as we safely could. The other thing is I and my team, we took our cues from people like Alex. The organizers didn't stop their work. They shifted to other venues. There was digital organizing, virtual organizing. And then once it was safe, using new strategies to do in-person voting in a way, organizing and registering voters in a way that was safe. And so that was the other cue for us, is if organizers like the Move Texas folks and folks who we're seeing in Florida and in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, and also as people were pivoting to mutual aid and helping their communities, then it felt like if those folks are okay with us documenting that process, then we want to do that. We want to follow that as much as possible.
So another challenge, I would think, is that this election is particularly, polarizing. People have very strong feelings, emotions about this. And so I'm just wondering if you could talk about making a documentary about such a polarizing topic and such a polarizing moment and keeping it PBS appropriate.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's always a challenge to take on anything that has to do with politics. And I think, to your point, I mean, more so now, we know, because of so many different reasons, that this political climate, this moment has become so polarized. I feel like it's not even an adequate term for kind of what we're experiencing. But what I've learned from, at this point, I'm an old timer. It's like in my 20 years of working in documentary and making films, when the work is people centered, you can bypass a lot of the noise. And so I think the trick is to kind of find credible people who are living a story and who are willing and able to share that perspective, and who are willing to kind of collaborate with you on a broader story. And I think even if you don't ideologically agree with people, if you approach the interviewing and documenting process with respect, with genuine mutual respect, then I think there's an ability to get, to tell these stories. And, I've always been a firm believer, and it's not my job to make films about people that I only agree with. I certainly prefer spending time with people that I agree with politically, but my job is to highlight, document reality to what is happening. I'm not, I think there's a whole vein of films that are strictly advocacy films and strictly propaganda. And I think we can see the dangers of that. I mean, I don't know if everyone watched the footage that the White House produced, President Trump's return to the White House from Walter Reed. It is just this incredibly very produced, piece of propaganda to demonstrate what they believe is, as a kind of strength. And so to me, that's the opposite. It's the opposite of what we're trying to do. We like the messiness, we like the dissonance, we like multiple voices, multiple perspectives, credible people, imperfect stories. Whereas something like that might as well be a commercial for a brand. It's very polished, very tailored, and geared towards sending one very specific kind of message. So I feel like in documentary, we're trying to create a parallel or a different kind of slice of life that allows for messiness and imperfection, but gets at some, hopefully, if we're doing our jobs and when we're lucky, gets at some deeper truth.
Okay, well, speaking of those diverse voices that are in the film, I want to go back to Alex for a minute and ask Alex, how did you get involved? How were you approached? Did you have any hesitation to get involved? What happened?
So I think the connection between us and the film crew, and I just enjoy listening to Bernardo talk about the fluidity of it, the dissonance of it. Organizing can be the same way. You make connections because you hit a road block somewhere. And this is no different than that. We actually became connected because I do organizing based around the state of Texas. And one of those places, in addition to San Antonio, was supporting some organizers on the ground in our team in San Marcos. We were actually working on a policy effort there to pass a cite and release ordinance, the first of its kind in the state, to make sure that folks who were committing a certain kind of misdemeanor would be cited rather than arrested, because we know that this is an epicenter of mass incarceration. These sorts of arrests are really why we have it as explosive a jail population as we do in Texas. And so as a result of those efforts and that organizing, we find allies on city council, we find allies among local elected officials. And one of those individuals at the time was a San Marcos City Council member named Joca Marquez, who I became very close with organizing on this issue. She encouraged us to continue building power on campus, where she was formerly a professor there at Texas State University, was very kind of like enthused with our approach to organizing, that we focused on building youth power, and her involvement on campus as a professor and then turned council member. Campus-based organizing was where she had cut her teeth on her campaign. So there was a natural complementary approach to politics that we had. And so this involvement with one another around the cite and release effort just had us connected. And so when she was connected to this crew who wanted to do a documentary on the complexities of the Latinx vote, it was Joca that said, you have to talk to Move Texas. So you can actually see her, I think, in the film, walking the line. And then you can also see her in the credits. She's one of the myriad of faces that are cycled through in the credit sequence. And so, that's basically how we became connected with one another. And we're really glad that the connection took place, because I think, as a viewer to the film, as well as a participant, you have a lot of very party-oriented discussion that takes place in the film. And it certainly has a place there, because one of the most profound arguments of the film is that there's no monolithic, Latino vote. And one of the things that we're doing is trying to come at this equation in a nonpartisan way. And so I think we have a unique sort of role to play in the story. And I'm very grateful that Joca was able to connect us to this crew to be a part of it.
Okay, I'm glad you brought up that point that the film sort of one of the, I guess, the crucial points that the film makes is that Latinos are not monolithic, and they have all these different opinions, and they come from, of course, different nations of origin, but also different religious backgrounds. And like there's this great segment on the evangelical vote, and of the segment on Florida. Again, if you haven't seen the film, it's available at pbs.org, streaming now through November 3rd. You really need to watch it. But the part about Florida, I think I found very eye-opening. But so I want to ask both of you, what are some myths about Latino voters?
I think the one that we consciously didn't include in the film was the idea of the Latino vote or electorate as the sleeping giant. I think we've all heard that term, and I think it's definitely time to retire that term. As a younger person, it always kind of irked me the wrong way, and I always thought, what does that mean exactly? And I think in it is this kind of blame the victim perspective that Latinos don't show up to polls because they're somehow lazy or sleepy, or it's just a deeply problematic term, and it doesn't acknowledge what the kind of the work, for instance, that Alex and team have been doing, just to what are the obstacles for Latino voters, like when they want to cast a ballot, when they want to participate. And I think what we've seen and what people talk about in the film is the historic de-investment in Latino communities, urban, rural, in the Northeast and the South and the West. And one interesting thing for me that kind of broke the myth was what we saw in Nevada, which is when, in this case, it was the Sanders campaign under Chuck Rocha, and we see another organizer, Belen Sisa, who's undocumented. They invested early in Nevada. They invested seriously in terms of long-term community engagement, Spanish language ads, culturally appropriate dialogue from staff that understood the same issues that the community cared about. And we saw that historic win that propelled Sanders to this, the caucus win in Nevada during the primaries. And that really, I think, is an important lesson. And so for me, that kind of is a myth that was punctured. It's, there's no sleeping giant when there's investment.
How about you, Alex?
Definitely. Just want to echo exactly what Bernardo says. I think there's a lot of onus placed on the voter and the sort of failure to fulfill expectation. And I think there's a number of ways in which, as Bernardo says, that erases the structural barriers. And number two also bites into this notion of demographics meaning destiny. And so, and by that I mean that, as the country gets younger and it becomes more people of color, that there's a presumption that necessarily implies a certain politics. And so all of that erases the, individuality of individual voters to draw political conclusions about their own backyard, their own reality. And I can tell you that having, nonpartisan conversations with voters, the full breadth of experience that you see in the film, I've encountered in my organizing with those youth voters as well. So, I just want to point that out, that some of the myths are that there is this, sort of grouping that we can artificially impose from the top down as a category. I do think that it can be an identity that's created. It's a definition of the word organizing, right? You organize something, you help people cohere an identity around a common message, a common goal. And so even though there is this way in which it seems to elide the complexity, organizers, their goal is to produce commonality so that power can be built in a concerted direction. And so, if it occurs from the bottom up, these sort of categories can have a lot of stability, but because they occur from the bottom up, it's the ties that emerge when you do bottom up organizing that make it stable. So I think part of the reason that it doesn't seem like it's appropriate to make these communities monolithic is because, it's a lot of punditry, it's not a lot of organizing. Whereas if you have the bottom up approach, it feels experientially different for everybody that's doing it. I think also too, one of the things I want to emphasize with the work that we do specifically around young voters is that young voters, especially young Black and Brown voters, don't turn out. And I think that just doesn't bear out in the trends, right? We've got a situation where 5.6 million Latinos are eligible to vote, and only 2.7 million of them are registered. But over the period between 2016 and 2020, we've added 1.5 million new voters. At the same time that that's taking place, 41% of them are under the age of 30, and 63% of them are people of color. And so that's exactly why organizations like ours are so critical. We've seen the fruits of our labor pay off. In 2018, the midterms, youth voter turnout was up 500%. So, these sorts of efforts, we see the progress, but it's important to understand that this energy is encountering a system that is not built with young voters in mind. So, for example, we don't have online voter registration, right? Young people are accustomed to doing pretty much everything else on their phone, but voter registration doesn't accommodate that. We also have to understand that young voters are new voters, and so every piece of paperwork, every additional step is more difficult to navigate than it would be if it was simple. So that's one point. We also understand that it's an incredibly unequal generation where we're one of the first generations where people say we'll do less well than our parents. And living where I do, there's a lot of folks waiting tables who are young. And so there's a lot of difficulty brought about just by, I'm concentrated on other things. I'm concentrated on, making rent and keeping a roof over my head. So all of the added complexities added in with the rest of life just make voter registration really, really hard for young people, and navigating the system really, really hard for young people. It's also a state where student ID is not voter ID, but concealed handgun carry licenses are. And so when you do that, when you treat certain forms of identification as eligible and other forms of identification as ineligible, you're shaping the electorate. And so they're shaping the electorate in a way that's not reflective of young people's activities. They're shaping the electorate in a way that makes participating difficult for young people. And then they're also just creating a circumstance where instead of these streamlined, modernized systems, which would be more conducive to youth participation, we've got a fragmentary county by county system where you've got to become a deputy voter registrar in the county where you want to register voters. And it's not always guaranteed that the county next door provides reciprocity for that fact. So organizers like us have to drive around counties and get this deputy voter registrar status in each county that we want to register voters in. And there's 254 counties in the state of Texas. Some congressional districts cover several counties. And so if you wanted to build power across a congressional race, or if you wanted to build power among a certain demographic of people, like young people across the state, hearkening back to something like the Freedom Rides, where folks went from the north to the south to register voters, Texas is, by system design, not a place that's conducive to that, because we've got that fragmentary approach. We've also got a situation where polling location closures are rampant in the state, right? So you've got, since 2013, 1,000 polling place closures, the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. 750 of those are in the state of Texas. So 75% of the closures, and we see that take place on college campuses where we have to fight to get a polling location there, understanding that, again, these voters, they got to go to school, they got to go to work. The more convenient we can make it, the more likely it is for them to turn out. And so you've got a scenario in which, again, our registration rates are higher than ever, our turnout rates are higher than ever, but the barriers still exist. And so it's sort of a circumstance where an unstoppable force meets a seemingly immovable object. And I'm thankful to say that even despite the barriers, we're still finding ways to turn out. And I think it's a credit to organizations like mine and organizers around the state for making it happen.
Thank you, Alex. We do have a question from the audience. I brought up the evangelicals, and so the question is, would you speak about the Latinx and evangelical voting trends? I think that's for Bernardo.
Sure. So in the film, we actually document three Christian faith leaders and their constituencies. So we start with Pascual Urabaso, who runs it's considered a mega church outside of Las Vegas in Nevada. And he is a diehard Trump supporter, and in particular around the issue of abortion. So his constituency is very strongly allied with Pence, and that that kind of very conservative evangelical community has built very strong bridges with Pence, and I should say the other way around. The Pence-Trump administration has really built these strong links with that slice of the electorate. But just as we talk about the Latino vote not being monolithic, the same is true of evangelicals. So it's, I think, roughly 1 in 6 Latinos identify as evangelical. But there's a lot of nuance under the hood, as we see in Orlando and Florida. There we have Reverend Gabriel Salguero. In fact, Alex and I were just on a panel with him, public media panel 2 days ago. And Salguero is very interesting because in some ways, he is very traditionally conservative and evangelical when issues of what he calls religious liberty, and it's the issue of abortion. But on issues of immigration and criminal justice and racial equity, he's actually much more progressive. And so what he talks about in the film, which was illuminating to me, is that he says we Hispanic evangelicals are politically homeless, and that we're not gonna just necessarily vote for someone. We don't have that kind of party loyalty. What we're gonna do is pick the candidate that best speaks to our issues. So in that regard, he thinks of Hispanic evangelicals as the kind of classic swing voter. The other perspective that we have from the third, religious perspective is I interviewed and got to spend time with Reverend Adan Mairena in Philadelphia, who's actually from Honduras originally and now serving a largely Puerto Rican community in Philadelphia, which has a very large and growing Puerto Rican community. And for those that don't know, obviously Puerto Ricans are US citizens by birth. And once they have an address and are registered in one of the 50 states, continental United States, they are able to vote in the presidential election. So there's a lot of interest in the coming weeks about how Puerto Rican voters in Florida and Pennsylvania will vote. But what Reverend Adan Mairena says is that, he thinks there's a kind of parallel between how the Trump administration handled Hurricane Maria in 2017, and many Puerto Ricans felt mocked by the images of Donald Trump tossing paper towels towards victims of the hurricane who'd lost their homes and lost everything. I think the criticism from many members of the Puerto Rican community is that, the president was treating it as some kind of lighthearted joke, but a lot of residents, as Mairena points out, feel that there's a kind of parallel between how Puerto Ricans were treated on the island after Hurricane Maria and how the country has been treated. Certainly poorer communities have been treated during the pandemic. And so I think what Mairena speaks to, even as a Presbyterian minister, is the angry vote and the kind of what's brewing beneath the surface, which is this hunger for reform, for criminal justice reform, for racial equity, and for a more just society. And so I think, to me, that was fascinating that you had 3 Christian pastors all having very different takes on how their communities are going to vote and the reasons for how they're going to vote.
Yeah. Puerto Rico is something that I think, it's such a hot topic right now because not only the hurricane, but then the just the overall financial crisis that's been brewing there for so long, and what all of those folks who still don't get to vote on the island. This is going to be interesting for demographers for years to come, I think. I did just want to ask, did anything surprising come out of this project for you, Bernardo? Anything that you weren't expecting?
Honestly, everything about it was surprising. I think that, we all tend to think after you've researched something, I've been making films about different aspects of the Latinx experience, but it's so truly diverse that, you have to wonder at some point if it even makes sense for us to have this frame in the first place. I think one perspective I really appreciated, and that I think we need to hear more from, and needs to be developed, is that we spoke to journalist Natasha Alford, who's an Afro-Latina and writes a lot about Black Latinx issues, and she pointed out that it was only in 2016 that Pew, which does some of the best research around the Latino community and politics in the Latino community, it was only 2016 that they began asking people whether or not they identified as Afro-Latino. So that it's only in the last 4 years that we're really beginning to collect data in this country about being Black and Latinx. And that, typically we talk about the Black vote and we talk about the Latinx vote, and we miss a whole section. It's, I guess, according to that Pew study, it's about a quarter of the self-identified Latino community that identifies as Black Latinx. So I think I think this whole conversation is really, it's about fluidity and nuance, and that it's not, we tend to shove things into boxes, and the reality typically is more complex than that. And I think that, on our side of my side of the fence in documentary, I think we're doing something right when we're able to get at that nuance. We're not always able to do that. And certainly with television, the pressure is to kind of ramp up tensions or identify things quickly. But I do think this storytelling, it benefits from being able to get at that nuance. And I think the, broadly categorized Latinx community, we know a lot about mixing, cultural mixing, mestizaje, having roots in many places. And so I think, this is just my perspective, but I do think Latinx storytellers have a unique lens through which to look at the world. And I think, because we're, our culture and history is made of many different things and comes from many different sources, we're able, if we're paying attention and using our eyes and ears, we're able, or our storytelling chops, whatever they may be, we're able to get at some of that nuance. And I think there's something there, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is a question for both of you. What do you hope this film will achieve?
You want to take that first, Bernardo, or do you want me to take it?
Sure. I think for me, it's been very nice to hear the reaction both from participants in the film and from fellow journalists. We got a nice shout out from Jorge Ramos, who said it was for him, it represented a new look at the Latinx vote. And so he's a veteran broadcast journalist that's been covering this. Edward Olmos, James Olmos also said he really appreciated it. So that's nice that some people who've been covering this a lot feel like this represents something new. I hope it's the beginning of public media opening its doors to more and varied perspectives, and also being open to different styles. I love Frontline. I think the PBS series Frontline is an excellent example of kind of really good broadcast journalism. But I think we're at a moment in time where we should be open to different styles. And so I hope that our documentary showcases a different style and opens up pathways to other makers who can do really solid journalism, but with kind of stylistic approaches that are new and fresh and might bring in younger audiences. Definitely.
I agree with that. I watching the film and participating in it, I was really blown away by as Bernardo said numerous times, the nuances and the complexities. And I think that speaking to the period we're in, where it feels so polarized, when you've got these really stark contrasts, the stereotypes start to come out, the binaries, the kind of one-dimensional views. And I think that this is a response to how we can't be shoehorned in that way. And I think in particular with us, the younger generation, we are trying to look at more complex frames. I think it's a more diverse history. And so for me as a viewer of the film, as much as a participant, like I said, it's, we, for Move, went through the same changes that the documentarians did in the arch of the film. And so our conversations changed profoundly where, previously it was folks wanting to get registered for a historic election, and then folks following the decisions about whether or not we would expand vote by mail eligibility because of the pandemic, and seeing the failure of some of the leadership, both at the national level and the state level, to do what seemed like reasonable accommodations given the circumstances to maximize the amount of people who could participate. Things like litigation over how long the early voting period is, where drop-off sites can be in counties like Harris County, where 4.7 million voters are going to try to cast a ballot this November. We saw, as Bernardo mentioned earlier too, racial justice, economic justice flow through those events. And so, just as the pandemic sort of exposed inexcusable decisions as, probably bold on their face suppression, which I think is much more stark for the viewers that we're, not the viewers, but the voters that we're dealing with. So too did the way the federal government behaved with protests over the summer regarding the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, individuals like that, Black Americans who, were extrajudicially murdered. And so there were a lot of ways in which that started to flow through the conversation around the vote. Young people were coming to us, I want to register to vote because I want to learn more about my local DA. I want to learn more about my local sheriff. I want to register to vote because, during the pandemic, I didn't get a lot of assistance from my government. And so there's a level of politicization that, people were comfortable introducing complexity, getting politicized very quickly in a way that I think is actually healthy for people's political literacy, right? They overnight, the conversation became a lot more sophisticated. People were connecting systems. And, I think it blows up a lot of stereotypes about young voters that we're low information voters. Maybe we don't understand a lot about the process of registering and then turning out, but, that can be explained by barriers. We definitely understand the ways in which the system oppresses us, the ways in which it's unjust. And so I was very pleased to see the ways in which the film spoke to kind of the various pressures, the outside pressures that do, shape something like the Latino vote, the Black Lives Matter movement, the pandemic, and the way that we experienced that in Texas. It definitely had the same level of complexity, but also the same level of promise that the caliber of the political conversation at a time when everybody says it's so low. I talk to young voters and it's incredibly sophisticated. And I'm very excited about that because, as we build power, that is going to be a torch that's passed to us. And I'm excited about, what we'll do with it, given our analysis, the talent to react to the problem.
Thank you for that. Bernardo, I want to ask you, how do we get more of these kinds of stories on big and small screens?
It's a great question. I mean, there's been some really good organizing over the years, and I do think there are some changes happening. I mean, in the wake of these mass mobilizations around race and criminal justice, we saw all of the platforms and broadcast networks suddenly highlight their Black programming. As many of my fellow filmmakers, African Americans, point out, it felt very disingenuous because they suddenly had to scramble for titles and and filmmakers. But in the same way, I think smart pressure can be exerted on the networks, so I think that's part of the conversation. The other is, I think there are organizations doing great work like Firelight Media, which is a New York-based production company, but it's also a hub and an incubator for young filmmaking talent of color. Those are kind of exciting spaces for filmmakers. And I'm committed to public media. I believe it has a responsibility to showcase diverse voices. And there are kind of established pathways. And I think many of us who've been doing this for a while, we know that we can continue to put pressure on some of those systems to ensure that not just our work, but the work that's coming up and is increasingly visually exciting, politically bold, that work has space. I do think we need to create more series. This is something that I talk about, and I think people roll their eyes, but we have a limited amount of real estate in the public media system that showcases independent voices. And that's frequently where filmmakers of color, independent filmmakers, showcase their work. I would really like to see the creation of a new series or an expansion of those spaces. And I think this is a good time to do that. Public media has a different responsibility than the for-profit commercial broadcasters. And as a result, I think those of us who are interested in organizing in politics can play a role in ensuring that public media stick to its original mission, and that is to serve the underserved and to really be a reflection of what the country looks like. And the country is changing rapidly, and I think some of the stations need to catch up to where we are.
Yeah. And I know your new film only came out 2 days ago, but what's next for you?
Yeah. I just had a baby, so that's why I was late today. I'm sleeping a few hours a night, so I'm dealing with my baby. I have a couple of projects that I'm working on. I have one long-term project that I've been working on for a while. It's an archival-driven project about the work of the Argentine forensic anthropology team. And it's a team that's been around for over 35 years, and they collect human remains to then use them in human rights trials. They're kind of this team that, that's been challenging the official cover-ups of typically corrupt regimes, and they've worked in 30 different countries. And it's a project where, again, I'm collaborating with a bunch of filmmakers and trying to tell the story as much as possible through archive. So that's a brand new kind of challenge for me and my team. And a couple of other things in the works. I might be doing something for HBO that's Texas related, in collaboration with Larry Wright, who wrote a memoir called God Save Texas. So I'm talking to him about that project as well.
Wow, okay. And Alex, with this election around the corner, I imagine you're pretty busy. What does the rest of this month look like for you?
So, my organization is going to be gearing up to get out the vote. And so I know our field team is very busy, having just wrapped the voter registration deadline, where we had to be fairly innovative, as Bernardo mentioned earlier. We are just starting to get our field operation back. And so we were out there with the face guards and face shields doing drive-through voter registration in partnership with colleges and universities, in partnership with the Spurs. For myself and the team that I work with, we're going to be focused on making sure that the number of polling locations is adequate. We're going to be focused on making sure that the number of poll workers is adequate. We want to avoid a situation where we have to shut down polling locations on the day of because our systems aren't ready for the number of voters that want to turn out. And so I fear that there could be a repeat of some of the footage where you see long lines. So we'll do everything over the next month to make sure that the systems are in place to make sure that that's avoided. And in addition to some of the voting rights work, I appreciate that the film speaks to this too. We'll continue to fight for some of the policy fights that we're in the middle of. So we're trying to bring a San Antonio cite and release ordinance into existence here in San Antonio. We're trying to do the same in Houston. And that's because, like everywhere else in the country, we have a crisis of policing too. And there are local names like Daryl Zamal Jr., Damian Daniels, which need to be organized around. And so as much as we're fighting for the rights of folks at the ballot box, we're also going to be fighting for racial and criminal justice reform over the next month as well, just because those campaigns are coming to a head. And so, that's sort of where I'll be focused at. is both making sure, again, that the right to vote is secured for as many students, for as many young people as possible, but also, giving them something to vote for when they actually go to the ballot box. And so we do that by organizing, by pointing out, the politicians that are failing us, just raising the tenor of the conversation. And so that's what I'll be focused on over the next month.
Wonderful. Okay, well, we've reached the end of our hour. So I want to thank Bernardo Ruiz and Alex Bernal for joining us tonight and sharing with us the sort of behind the scenes look at the work that the two of you do. I do want to encourage everybody to check out Latino Vote, Dispatches from the Battleground, available to stream for free at pbs.org now through November the 3rd. Thank you both so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much for hosting this conversation. It's such a pleasure to be connected to you both in dialogue. And I hope we can do this in person, a version of this in person someday.
Yes, that would be nice, wouldn't it? Okay, we're going to sign off now, but remember to come back to visit Macri's Facebook page next Wednesday at 7 o'clock. We have Dr. Cynthia Orozco giving a talk on Mexican-American women and civil rights. I hope you can join us. Stay safe, wear a mask, and vote if you can. Good night.